You ever been just so totally convinced of something, that you thought you were right, some argument, some new thing, and then only to find out you were just like totally wrong? Just the most awful feeling in the world. It's one thing to kind of be uncertain and voice your opinion. It's another thing like to be totally convinced and really just be off and wrong. And so this morning, we're going to look at something that we're going to look at a story in John 18, and there's actually 5 characters in this story. It's a fascinating read, actually, if you read John 18 in its entirety. I think there's about 40 verses. And in that 40 verses, there's a scene that's happening. It's a scene. And there's 5 characters beside Jesus, and every one of those characters in the story are totally convinced they're right. And it ends up not so much. I want to start at the end, and then I'll come back to the beginning. So in John 18, it says, the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. There's 3 groups right there. There's the Jewish leaders, there's Caiaphas, the high priest, and then there is Pilate, the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. So Jesus has been indicted by the Jewish authorities, the religious police, if you will, the Sanhedrin. And he's been indicted as a heretic. And Pilate, however, the secular government, the Roman government, says, you take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. So Pilate is sort of throwing the ball back into the court of the Jews, the cultural structure within the structure. The Jews were living under Roman dominion, if you're not familiar with the story. So you have both a religious structure and a political structure. And they said, we have no right to execute anyone. So they sort of tip their hand and they tell Pilate, this is what we want. We don't want you just to judge him. We want him dead. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace and summoned Jesus and asked him. So here's this picture of just he and Jesus standing there sort of face to face. And Pilate is going to have a conversation with this strange captive. He said, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus responds, is that your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me? You can take this home later and just read John 18, let your mind run on that scene. That question Jesus sort of throws back at Pilate. So was this born in you, or are you listening to other people? Isn't that interesting? Isn't it weird how rare original ideas are in politics and so forth today? But that's another story, right? Am I a Jew? Pilate replies. So it's kind of this, there's kind of, that's tainted with contempt and racism, which was rampant there. Am I a Jew? Am I a Jew that your own people and chief priests have handed you over to me? What is it you've done? And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but my kingdom is now from another place. So you are a king then, said Pilate. And Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. So he says, I am a king, I have a kingdom, and the reason I'm here is to testify to what is true. And everyone and so you can just imagine Jesus is bound standing before this governor, and it's almost like he sort of just draws this line in the sand and says, and everybody on the side of truth listens to me. When you're before someone who has your life in their hands, that may not be it's not the time to throw down usually, right? But Jesus just throws down and says, hey, here's the line. Everybody on the side of truth listens to me. And Pilate comes back and says, and I can almost hear this, sorry for the interpretation here, but I can almost see the political arrogance. What is truth? Can you hear the sarcasm and the cynicism and the superiority? What is truth? Pilate's a politician, and sometimes truth is relative, right? Depending on what cycle of the election year you may be in. And with this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. But it's your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. It was a Jewish custom. They could appeal to the governor to release somebody. You want me to release the king of the Jews? In quotation marks. They shouted back, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. And Barabbas was a common sort of a revolutionary. So they're both revolutionaries, in a way. But Barabbas was a political revolutionary. Jesus, of course, had another thing going, a kingdom. And they cry out, say, give us Barabbas. And of course, if you read the other accounts in the parallel Gospels, they take Jesus away. Have you ever heard this saying, this idea? Well, we don't want to come down on the wrong side of history. It was actually made popular by a president not too long ago. He would quote that oftentimes. You don't want to come down on the wrong side of history. Listen to this. This is just a little snippet from the New York Post, a writer by the name of Jonah Goldberg. He says, in domestic politics, people, mostly liberals, tend to say, you're on the wrong side of history about social ideas that are breaking their way. It's a handy phrase, loosely translated as, you're going to lose eventually, so why don't you give up now? And it's usually tainted, I'll say this, with a sense of a little bit of sarcasm and superiority. Karl Marx popularized the idea that opposition to the inevitability of socialism was anti-intellectual and anti-scientific. The progression of history is scientifically knowable, quote the Marxists, and so we need not listen to those who object to our programs. Later, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and others would use this reasoning to justify the murders of millions of inconvenient people. It was a God on our side argument minus God, he writes. You hear what he's saying there? We capture that there is a movement, there is a group of people, and Pilate represents that movement, who have within themselves power in the moment. They have political position, and they challenge anything that stands in the way in their minds of the inevitable march of whatever it is they're in charge of at the moment. But if you read, the last century certainly proved that wrong. The 1900s was the bloodiest century in the history of mankind when it came to war and what human beings did to one another. So it didn't quite work out the way they thought. Now, if you look at this picture, this thing in John, let me read just the beginning of John real quick. This is John 1. And when they'd finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. There was a garden. He and his disciples went into it. Now, here come the other characters. Now, Judas, who had betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had met him there with his disciples. So Judas comes into the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and officials from the chief priests. There's this religious group, the Pharisees, carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. And Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I'm he." And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. And when Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked, "Who do you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you I'm he. If you're looking for me, let these men go." This happened so the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I've not lost one you gave me." And then Simon Peter, who had a sword, the follower of Jesus, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. It's interesting that the writer includes that little detail. It doesn't say Peter drew the sword and tried to cut the guy's head off. It says he just cut off his ear, like a surgical strike. This is just a warning shot. I'm just so good with the sword. It's like, no. And Jesus commanded Peter, "Put it away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" It had to have been just the strangest sound, right? What? "Jesus, we're here. It's us, your faithful disciples." And then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. And Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be a good idea if one man died for the people. So you can read the rest of the story throughout the week as we get towards Holy Week. But I want to just kind of call your attention to a couple things. Listen to the people who are in the story. Listen to the characters, those 5 characters, remember? There's Judas, Judas the individualist, Judas the revolutionary who has been with Jesus and decides that is not the train I want to get on. That is not the guy I want to hook my star to. He's done some amazing things, but he's not going to accomplish what I feel like needs to happen to bring our nation to freedom. He's a religious politician, so to speak. He's got an agenda, and he's going to fulfill that agenda. And you know the story. He sells out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. That's what's happening here. And then there's Caiaphas, the religious high priest, trusted with all the religious history and the care of the Jewish people. The religious high priest, who is actually too going to deny and sell out Jesus for the sake of expediency, because the Roman government and Caiaphas, the high priest, the Sanhedrin, they washed one another's backs. They took care of each other. They made sure they were comfortable. They could live. They could coexist peacefully. There's Pilate, the politician, driven by just pure self-interest. Pilate wanted to stay in power. Pilate was under the Roman rule, and Pilate was the governor of that area, and Pilate was going to have the last word and keep the peace. He condemns the king of the universe. And then there's the Jewish crowd who call for his blood. Who do you want? Give us Barabbas, right? You know, the crowd, the majority. You know what's crazy about all four of these people? Every one of them was, listen, and this is it this morning. This is all I got on the way. Every one of them was absolutely convinced they were on the right side of history. Every one of them was passionate and sincere, and whatever word you'd like to describe. Every one of them was like, yes, this is the right decision. And every one of them was proved wrong. Wrong. Not just kind of wrong, a little bit wrong, absolutely wrong. They were found out later to have been driven by all kinds of motives that really led them into the wrong place. And then there's Peter. Peter, of all the people who might have gotten it right, you'd think it would have been him. Peter gets picked on a lot, and probably with good reason, because Peter was getting it wrong all the time. Peter was wrong on the mountain of transfiguration when the Father appeared, and Peter kind of wanted to make it into a tourist attraction. Lord, can we just set up 3 tabernacles here? Peter got it wrong when Jesus said, "Who do men say that I am? You're the Christ, the Son of the living God, and no, you're not going to the cross. Get behind me, Satan." Right? That's an uncomfortable way of being wrong. Yes, you got it right. Actually, you're Satan. Get out of the way. It's like, Jesus, you're kicked out of Sunday school because you're talking like the devil. Get out. Peter got it wrong when Jesus was washing his feet and said, "Lord, you're never going to wash my feet." And Jesus said, "Well, then you have nothing to do with me." Okay. Peter got it wrong as well as everybody else. You know, you would think in 2018, after reading that, after being through what they went through, I know it was a long time ago, but listen, that should give us pause. Don't you think you should just kind of go, man, it happened to those 5 guys. I wonder if everything I'm passionate about is right. Not right according to history, current history, because obviously that's a bad measure. You know, in their current situation, according to the way things were going currently, politically, religiously, or whatever, of course they felt. They were like in this echo chamber. They were looking around saying, I must be right because somebody agrees with me. You know, you can imagine when Peter pulled out the sword, I wonder if the other disciples were like, "Yeah, get him, Peter. Yeah, that's what we all think. We're too chicken to get our swords, but yeah, that's what we think. Let's defend the Lord." And when there's a crowd, I think sometimes we feel we're given the illusion, yeah, I'm right too. But later history proves us wrong. And then you have Jesus just drawing this line. If you're with me, you've got to get on the side of truth. Now, before we get too confident, the church, the followers of Jesus for the last few thousand years, we've landed sometimes on the wrong side of history because we've been caught up in the moment, or we've been contaminated with politics, or we have got this passionate agenda that we love so deeply that it blinds us, Or we're listening to a moral majority, which I'm not sure either exists. And we get on this bandwagon, and maybe we don't pull out a real sword, but maybe we pull out, words. Proverbs says, reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing, Proverbs says. If you don't believe me, in the late 1500s, there was a Polish astronomer. His name was Nicholas Copernicus. He published a paper called The Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. And basically what he did in this paper was he floated this new idea in 1540 that the earth wasn't the center of the universe. I know, it must have been shocking. Actually, it was. Because in those days, the church, the keepers of science, said that the earth was the center and the sun revolved around the earth. That sounds silly to us now, doesn't it, right? On this side of history. And he was so ardent about that, he was so convinced about that when confronted with his judges, his religious judges, he refused to recant and said, it's true, it's true. And for that, he spent the last probably 20 years of his life under house arrest. Just a few decades later comes along another scientist named Galileo, reads those papers, and he invents this incredible little thing called a telescope. The first one he invented was about a 20 power. That's about like your kids' binoculars you get in those games at Walmart, right? And he went on to invent a much higher power telescope and realized that Copernicus was right. We're the ones moving. It's the earth. It's the sun that's the center of the universe. He too was brought before the Inquisition and threatened with death if he didn't recant. They cut a deal and he spent the rest of his years in house arrest. And it's been said that as he was led away, he muttered, "Yet it doth move, yet it doth move." The church picked up on it and apologized 450 years later. 1993, Pope John Paul apologized to the families of those men saying, "You were right. Sorry." Before the church gets too cocky, we have to look at ourselves and say, man, what is the side of truth? And I'm going to tell you, the only sure place today is next to Jesus. Frankly, the majority could be wrong. The science could not be all there. The church may, the latest bandwagon, and they're endless. And we have to be careful. You know, they bring Peter in and Jesus. And here's this last part. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. This is the same adrenaline-filled Peter that had just done his thing in the garden with the sword. And because this disciple was known to the high priest, now this is John writing, right? So this is John describing, he had an inside track with the high priest and he gets into the courtyard. And Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, John, who knew the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty. You know, so here's the picture. John knows somebody and he speaks to the servant girl who's at the door and says, "Let this guy in, let this guy in, that guy, let him in." And as she brings Peter in, she says, "Hey, aren't you one of the man's disciples too?" And he replies, "I am not." Again, you can just hear the "I am not." It was cold and the servants and officials stood around the fire they had made to keep warm. And Peter was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I've spoken openly to the world. I've taught in the synagogues at the temple with all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is that the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" And it sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, though, Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "Hey, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denies it, saying, "I am not." One of the servants' high priests, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, I love that. Hey, wait a minute, just a second. Dude, I will never forget a face. I will never forget that look, man. You're the guy, you're the madman with the sword in his hand, tried to kill my friend, kill my relative. You are with this guy. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denies it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. A rooster begins to crow. The gospel writer Matthew would record that at that moment, Jesus just looked at Peter. You can imagine all this drama's going on. Jesus is just standing there. He's just been slapped by the high priest, and he's before these men, and they're calling for his head. And then his best friend, the third time, denies him, and Jesus just looks at him. And that's not a shock to Peter, because Jesus had said to him when things were calm, Peter, remember what Peter said? Peter says this, Lord, I will never, everybody else may abandon you, but I will never deny you. And Jesus said, actually, Peter, you're going to deny me not once, but 3 times. And I guess as I read this, as I was studying this week, I thought to myself, this is me. And this is us. You see, because without the Spirit of God operating in my life, in your life, man, without the presence of Jesus in your life, in my life, we are so susceptible to just getting it wrong and being convinced we're right. It is such a dangerous, dangerous place to be, guys. And there's no end to the controversies and the things that bait us into arguments and cause us to get behind. I'm not saying we can avoid all that, but I'm just saying there's this attitude of whatever intellectual arrogance or scientific arrogance or religious arrogance, but it all is the same. It's all the same root. It's this self-sufficient pride that says, I can't possibly be wrong because I'm just so sincere. And listen, sincerity is not the measure of all things. I mean, it's an admirable quality, but listen, sincerity is not the measure of everything. Jesus said it's truth. It's being on my side, and that's the side of truth. Put the sword away, would you? And I don't know what that means for you this morning, but man, our world is just full right now of just people, we've got these texting swords or these Twitter swords or these social media swords, and we're just like, yeah, well, I'm going to I won't cut your head off. I just want one of your ears, just like, because I'm right and you're wrong, and and I got 4 scriptures to back it up. Picked them randomly, but they fit my argument. Judas went and hung himself. Go thou and do likewise. And what thou doest, do as quickly. There's 3. How many more do you need, right? It's like, dear Lord. Dear Lord. It's like, what do we sound like? J.C. Ryle in his book Holiness says, we are too apt to forget the temptation to sin will rarely present itself in its true colors. Never when we are tempted to sin will we hear it say to us, oh, I'm your deadly enemy. I want to ruin your life. That's not how it works. Sin instead comes to us like Judas with a kiss. So truth is on trial, and we get to be in the audience of history. Truth is on trial, and we get to be in the audience of history, and you and I have to make a decision on which side we will come down. And I want to say to you this morning that we live in incredible times. I'm not up here I hope it doesn't sound cynical or pessimistic. I'm just trying to sound this alarm that we live in incredible times, and we live in opportune times to share the gospel. But the gospel is not going to be heard from a shrill and angry, sword-wielding church, because the world will react in the same spirit. In fact, my contention is that oftentimes we find ourselves reacting in the spirit of the world to the world. We picked up on that. We've been triggered by that, by an angry, shrill, texting, twittering world. And so our tendency, the bait, is that this is a righteous argument. I think I'll enter in, but we enter in the same spirit as Peter did. It's easy to see why the first four were wrong. Peter's a different study. And so God calls us to examine our hearts in the days we live. How did Jesus respond? And some of you may look at that and see that as weakness. I don't know. Because you want a conquering Savior in that moment. But I want to remind you that Jesus didn't come to conquer politics. He came to redeem fallen Adam and everybody else who'd been contaminated by Adam's sin. That's the heart of the gospel as we move into the next few weeks towards Easter. You know, as we finish this morning, I just want to finish with the words that Jesus spoke to Peter in Luke 22. The worship team can come up. You remember that scene I was describing earlier? Matthew and Luke would record this intimate moment at the Last Supper, and Jesus says these words to him, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you all his wheat." So he's talking to Peter, but he's including them all. He says, "But Simon, I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you've turned back, would you strengthen your brothers?" And of course, Peter's declaration, "I'm ready to go to prison and death." And Jesus says, "I prayed for you. I've prayed for you." Do you remember, we'll see this in a few weeks after the resurrection, and the disciples have gone back to the only thing they know is fishing, and Jesus shows up on the shore while they're in the water. "You guys caught anything?" "No, we've been laboring all night." "Yeah." "Throw the net on the other side." Who is this guy? He's just the God who knows where all the fish are, that's all. So they throw the net on the other side. The net fills, they haul it all to land. Peter, though, doesn't row back because he realizes who told him, and he jumps overboard. It's the Lord. Now listen, and as he gets to the land, there's a fire going and breakfast is ready. Isn't that the coolest picture of the Savior? He's not standing there with his arms crossed, ready to just ream them out for their foolishness. He makes them breakfast. I love that. It's hard to make breakfast for people you hate. You know what I mean? I'm serious. Think about that. You're not going to make breakfast for people you can't stand. Because breakfast is this intimate moment on the beach. "Hey, Peter, you love me?" I don't think the first one, maybe he didn't get it. "Well, of course, Lord, you know I love you." Okay. "Hey, Peter, do you love me?" "Gosh, Lord, you know all things." And then the third time, Peter must have felt, "Oh man, that's right. It's 3 for 3. It's 3 for 3 here. Lord, I've denied you 3 times. And Jesus says, "Peter, would you just feed my sheep?" And he commissions Peter. In all of his wrongness and wrong-sidedness, he commissions Peter. He restores him and commissions him to feed the sheep of God. That's the heart of God. Redemption and commissioning. "Peter, I'm not going to throw you away. Ditch the sword thing, and would you just feed my sheep?" Father, as we finish this morning, I'm not sure what we struggle with. I know in this room there's just a whole variety of personalities and character, myself and backgrounds, political persuasions, maybe theologies, our experiences with you, our opinions about current events, our opinions about sin and things that have happened to us, things that are happening in our community. I would pray this morning as we take communion together, as we share the Lord's Supper, that we would take heed the words of Paul, that as much as lies within us, we would live peaceably with one another. Before you get up and take the elements this morning, I would love to ask you to examine yourself. To examine your own heart this morning. What's in my hand? Am I at war this morning with a sword in my hand in the name of God? Because I'm passionate about something? And my question just simply is what's in your heart now? What's in your hand first, but what's in your heart? Because your heart is driving your hand. Do I have the heart of the Savior who redeemed me? Is there anger? Is there bitterness? Is there vindictiveness? Is there vengeance? Is there some sense of justice? As we read this morning before we started, the steadfast mercies of the Lord never come to an end. Before we take, would you just take a second and just ask the Lord this morning, Father, Holy Spirit, examine my heart. Examine my heart. When you're ready, you can just pick up the elements and then we'll take together as we finish.